John stared at his reflection. The bathroom was dimly lit, casting eerie shadows that danced around him. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in on him. The face staring back seemed unfamiliar, a stranger peering out from behind his own eyes. It was as if the mirror had become a portal to another world, one where he was an outsider. He blinked slowly, expecting the image to shift, to morph back into the comforting familiarity of self. But the stranger remained. Each blink felt like an eternity, a desperate attempt to reclaim his identity. His reflection mimicked his movements, a cruel parody of his growing unease. Every twitch, every nervous gesture was mirrored perfectly, yet it felt wrong, as if the reflection had a mind of its own. John ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he couldn't seem to shake. The texture of his hair felt foreign, almost alien, under his fingertips. He wondered if he was losing his mind. He felt a growing disconnect, a chasm widening between his thoughts and the world around him. It was as if he was drifting away, becoming a mere observer in his own life. It was subtle at first, a whisper at the edge of his awareness. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur that he could easily dismiss as his imagination. But lately the whispers had become screams, threatening to shatter the fragile peace he clung to. The voices were relentless, echoing in his mind, growing louder with each passing day. He wasn't sure when it had started. The days blurred together, a haze of confusion and fear. He tried to pinpoint the moment when everything changed, but it eluded him. Perhaps it was the nightmares, vivid and unsettling, that clung to him even after he woke. They were more than just dreams. They were experiences, as real as the world he lived in. Or maybe it was the feeling that he was always being watched, eyes boring into his back even in a crowded room. The sensation was inescapable, a constant reminder of his growing paranoia. Whatever the cause, a creeping dread had taken root in his mind, twisting his thoughts into knots of fear and paranoia. It was a relentless force, gnawing at his sanity. John looked away from the mirror, unable to bear the scrutiny of his own gaze any longer. The reflection felt like an accusation, a silent judgment of his unraveling mind. He had to get a grip, he told himself. He took deep breaths, trying to steady his racing heart. The room felt like it was spinning, a dizzying whirl of anxiety and fear. This was just stress, he reasoned, the pressures of work and life finally taking their toll. He tried to convince himself that it was normal, that everyone felt this way sometimes. But deep down, a chilling certainty began to solidify. This was something more, something far more sinister. The realization sent a shiver down his spine, a cold dread that settled in his bones. He looked at his hands, trembling slightly. They were his hands, yet they felt detached, as if they belonged to someone else. The sensation was unnerving, a stark reminder of his disconnection. John began to pace, the small bathroom feeling increasingly claustrophobic. Each step echoed in the confined space, amplifying his sense of entrapment. He needed to escape, but there was nowhere to go. He gripped the sink, staring into the mirror with a newfound determination. He had to confront this, whatever it was. He couldn't let it consume him. The reflection stared back, unyielding, as if daring him to face the truth. Taking a deep breath, John tried to calm himself. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing. In and out, in and out. The simple act of breathing became his anchor, a lifeline in the storm of his thoughts. When he opened his eyes, he looked at the mirror with a new resolve. The stranger was still there, but John was no longer afraid. He would face this head-on, whatever it took. The battle for his mind had begun. The whispers started subtly at first, faint murmurs that John initially dismissed as the creaking of an old apartment building. He had just moved into the apartment, an old, creaky place with a history that seemed to seep from its very walls. The first few nights were uneventful, just the usual sounds of an old building settling, but then the whispers began. But as the days bled into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just background noise. They were a constant, gnawing presence that seemed to follow him everywhere. John found himself covering his ears, trying to block out the incessant murmurs, but it was no use. The whispers were inside his head, and there was no escaping them. They seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, slithering through the air vents, worming their way into his mind. John would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the whispers as they grew louder and more distinct. They seemed to be speaking directly to him, their voices filled with a malevolent glee. They whispered his name, taunting him, mocking his growing fear. John, John! they would hiss, their voices dripping with malice. He would sit up in bed, his heart pounding, his eyes darting around the room, but there was never anyone there. Just the whispers, always the whispers. They spoke of things he thought were hidden deep within his past, secrets he had buried under layers of denial and self-deception. Memories he had long since forgotten, or tried to forget, were dragged to the surface, their details vivid and painful. The whispers knew everything about him, every dark secret, every hidden shame. The line between reality and hallucination began to blur. John found himself questioning his own sanity, wondering if the whispers were real or just a figment of his imagination. The world around him seemed to shift and warp, the edges of reality becoming increasingly indistinct. He would see things out of the corner of his eye, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, faces that appeared and disappeared in an instant. He couldn't be sure what was real anymore. Every day was a struggle to maintain his grip on reality, to keep the whispers at bay. He would pinch himself, slap his own face, anything to remind himself that he was still here, still real. But the whispers were relentless, and his sense of reality continued to erode. John tried to ignore the whispers, to lose himself in the mundane routines of his life. He would get up, go to work, come home, and try to distract himself with television or books. But the whispers were always there, lurking in the background, waiting for a moment of silence to creep back into his mind. He went to work, forced himself to socialize with colleagues, even attempted to rekindle a long-neglected social life. He would smile and laugh, but it was all a facade. Inside, he was falling apart, the whispers eating away at his sanity. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the way he would zone out in the middle of a conversation, his eyes distant and unfocused. But the whispers followed him everywhere, a constant, insidious presence he couldn't escape. They were with him at work, at home, even in his dreams. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers still echoing in his mind, their words twisted and incomprehensible. His friends noticed a change in him. They would ask if he was okay, their voices filled with concern, but John couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth. How could he explain the whispers, the way they haunted him day and night? He was afraid they would think he was crazy, that they would abandon him. He was withdrawn, his once easy laughter replaced by a strained silence. He would sit with his friends, but he was never really there. His mind was always elsewhere, lost in the labyrinth of whispers that had become his reality. His friends tried to reach out to him, but he pushed them away, afraid of what they might see if they looked too closely. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now held a haunted, hunted look. The whispers had taken their toll, draining the life from him bit by bit. He would stare at his reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the person looking back at him. The whispers had changed him, turned him into a shadow of his former self. They asked if he was okay, their voices laced with concern. But John, trapped in his own personal hell, couldn't bring himself to confide in them. He was afraid of what they might think, afraid of being judged. So he kept the whispers to himself, letting them fester and grow in the dark corners of his mind. But John, trapped in his own personal hell, couldn't bring himself to confide in them. He was afraid of what they might think, afraid of being judged. So he kept the whispers to himself, letting them fester and grow in the dark corners of his mind. He retreated further into himself, isolating himself from the very people who might have been able to help. The whispers had won, driving a wedge between him and the rest of the world. John was alone, trapped in a prison of his own making, with only the whispers for company. The world around John began to distort, reality shifting and warping like a funhouse mirror. It was as if the very fabric of his existence was being stretched and twisted, making everything he once knew seem alien and unfamiliar. The streets he walked every day now felt like a maze, each turn leading him deeper into a surreal nightmare. Colors seemed too bright, sounds too sharp, sensations amplified to an almost unbearable degree. The once comforting hum of the city now felt like a cacophony of chaos, each sound a piercing dagger to his senses. The vibrant hues of the buildings and signs, which once brought life to the city, now seemed to scream at him, their intensity almost blinding. His senses, once reliable guides, now bombarded him with a chaotic symphony of overwhelming stimuli. The gentle breeze that used to soothe him now felt like a harsh gale, each gust a reminder of his fragile state. The once rhythmic pulse of the city had turned into an erratic beat, leaving him disoriented and lost. Faces in the crowd swirled and morphed, their features twisting into grotesque caricatures. Friends and strangers alike became unrecognizable, Their once familiar faces now nightmarish masks. Each encounter left him more isolated, more detached from the world he once knew. Conversations became a jumbled mess of incoherent noise, the words swirling around him like leaves caught in a whirlwind. Every attempt to communicate felt like shouting into a void, his words lost in the maelstrom of his mind. The once simple act of speaking had become an insurmountable challenge, each sentence a battle against the chaos within. He felt himself teetering on the precipice of madness, desperately clinging to the remnants of his sanity. Sleep offered no escape. Each night was a relentless assault of vivid nightmares, each more terrifying than the last. The boundary between his dreams and reality began to blur, leaving him in a constant state of dread. His nightmares intensified, bleeding over into his waking hours. The horrors that once only haunted his sleep now followed him into the daylight, casting long shadows over his every move. He could no longer distinguish between the phantoms of his mind and the real world, each moment a waking nightmare. He saw shadowy figures lurking in the periphery of his vision, felt phantom touches on his skin. These apparitions, always just out of reach, filled him with a deep-seated paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat, every touch a reminder of his slipping grasp on reality. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, hunted by something unseen. The sensation of eyes on him was constant, an ever-present weight on his shoulders. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting to see some malevolent force ready to pounce. John tried to explain what he was experiencing to a doctor, stumbling over his words, struggling to articulate the terror that consumed him. Each visit felt like a desperate plea for help, but the words that came out were disjointed, a mere shadow of the true horror he felt. The doctor's office, once a place of solace, now felt like another layer of his torment. But his words sounded jumbled and disjointed, the ramblings of a madman. Each attempt to convey his experience only seemed to deepen the chasm between him and those around him. The more he tried to explain, the more isolated he felt, trapped in a prison of his own making. The doctor, his face a mask of professional concern, spoke of stress and anxiety, prescribed a cocktail of pills that promised to dull the edges of his reality. But John knew that no pill could truly touch the depths of his despair. The doctor's words, though well-meaning, felt hollow, a temporary bandage on a wound that ran far too deep. Each pill was a reminder of his struggle, a symbol of his fight against the encroaching darkness.